in the high country of Colorado, where the tree line fractures into granite and sky. The wilderness appears vast but harmless. Families walk narrow trails bordered by wildflowers. Retirees carry trekking poles and hydration packs. Children run ahead, their voices echoing briefly before dissolving into pine and wind. It is a place designed, at least on the surface, for memory making. But in certain stretches of American wilderness, something else lingers beneath the beauty, a pattern so quiet and so consistent that it often goes unnoticed until it is too late. On a mild July afternoon, 9-year-old Ethan Caldwell hiked with his parents along a well-marked trail outside a popular national park corridor. The terrain was not extreme. The weather was stable. Other hikers passed in both directions. Ethan walked slightly ahead, scanning the tree line the way children do, curious but within view. His father stopped briefly to adjust a backpack strap. His mother paused to photograph a distant ridgeline, glowing in afternoon light. When they looked forward again, Ethan was no longer visible on the path. The distance between visibility and disappearance measured less than a minute. His parents assumed he had rounded a bend in the trail. They called his name. Their voices traveled, but nothing answered back. The trail ahead remained empty. There were no branching paths in that section, no sudden drop-offs, no water crossings. The forest floor was layered in soft soil and pine needles that should have preserved footprints. Yet when they hurried forward, there were none that clearly separated from the churn of older tracks. It was as if the trail had swallowed him without disturbance. Within 30 minutes, park rangers were notified. Within an hour, organized search efforts began. Volunteers formed lines and moved shoulder to shoulder across expanding grids. Canine units were deployed. Ethan's clothing scent was provided. The dogs initially reacted, pulling handlers several yards into a dense section off the trail, and then abruptly stopping. They circled. They whined. They returned to the starting point. The scent trail did not fade gradually, it ended. By late afternoon, a thin fog began rolling in across the higher elevations. Weather forecasts had predicted clear skies through evening. Search coordinators adjusted plans as visibility shifted. Helicopters performed aerial sweeps before dusk. Thermal imaging revealed nothing beyond natural heat signatures from rock and wildlife. Ethan had vanished in terrain that did not logically allow concealment. Cases like Ethan's rarely make national headlines. They are categorized as tragic but explainable incidents. A child wanders, becomes disoriented, succumbs to exposure. Yet when investigators later examined similar cases across multiple states, unsettling consistencies began to emerge. Victims often disappeared in transitional zones, areas where forest meets granite, where water sources cut through rock, where elevation changes subtly but rapidly. Many vanish within moments of brief separation. In several reports, weather conditions shift shortly after the disappearance, complicating search efforts. And repeatedly, train tracking dogs fail to follow scent beyond specific natural boundaries. The wilderness does not behave like an urban environment. There are variables beyond human control: wildlife movement, sudden terrain shifts, microclimates. But search and rescue professionals operate with statistical expectations. Lost individuals tend to move downhill. Children typically seek cover or attempt to retrace steps. Footwear leaves impressions. Sound carries in predictable ways. In these cases, those expectations fracture. As darkness settled on the first night of Ethan Caldwell's disappearance, search teams expanded outward in calculated rings. Infrared drones scanned ravines and rock outcroppings. Volunteers called his name until their voices grew hoarse. The forest absorbed every sound and returned only wind. There were no torn branches suggesting panic, no dropped personal items marking direction, no signs of animal disturbance. The stillness felt intact, almost preserved. In the following days, the search radius widened dramatically. Topographical maps were analyzed for hidden crevices or sinkholes. Nearby streams were checked repeatedly. Helicopters returned at first light each morning. Yet despite the scale of the effort, the terrain refused to yield evidence. Ethan had disappeared in one of the most visited natural regions in the country, within range of dozens of hikers, and under conditions that should have favored rapid recovery. When investigators later compared his case to others spanning decades, they identified clusters, geographic pockets where similar disappearances occurred. The victims varied in age and background, but the circumstances carried echoes: brief separation, sudden silence, terrain near granite formations, search dogs losing track abruptly. Individually, each case could be interpreted as tragic misfortune. Together, they formed a question that resisted dismissal. The wilderness has always carried risk. Exposure, injury, miscalculation, these are realities of nature. But the speed and completeness of certain disappearances introduce a different dimension. It is not merely that people are getting lost. It is that they are vanishing under conditions that appear to deny the normal progression of getting lost. The sequence skips steps. There is no visible struggle, no gradual trail of error. As the weeks passed and Ethan Caldwell remained missing, the forest returned to routine. Tourists continued hiking the same trail. Photographs were taken at the same scenic overlook. Weather systems moved across the ridge lines, as they always had. Nothing about the landscape signaled disruption. The only absence was human, precise, quiet, and unresolved. And when his case file was eventually placed beside dozens of others sharing the same subtle markers, one realization surfaced with uncomfortable clarity. This was not an isolated vanishing point. It was part of a larger pattern waiting to be understood. If Ethan Caldwell's disappearance had remained an isolated tragedy, it might have settled quietly into the archives of wilderness accidents. Families would grieve, search teams would document their efforts, and the forest would close around the absence. But when investigators began placing similar case files side by side, something shifted. The panic that follows any missing person report gave way to something colder, a pattern that refused to look accidental. Across multiple states, in parks separated by thousands of miles, the circumstances echoed each other with unsettling precision. Victims disappeared within minutes of brief separation from companions. Weather changes followed with strange timing. Search dogs lost scent abruptly, not gradually, and many of the vanishings occurred near granite formations or water sources. The similarities were not dramatic on their own. It was their repetition that carried weight. Former law enforcement officer David Paulides began assembling these cases after recognizing anomalies in missing persons. Reports tied to national parks. His documentation, later organized within the Missing 411 series, focused not on speculation but on documented consistencies. Official reports, ranger logs, weather records, and search summaries formed the backbone of the analysis. The question was not what caused the disappearances, but why the circumstances surrounding them appeared statistically aligned. One recurring element involved geographic clustering. When mapped, disappearances did not scatter randomly across wilderness areas. Instead, they formed pockets, concentrated zones where cases accumulated over years. Portions of the Sierra Nevada showed repeated incidents. Sections of the Pacific Northwest mirrored similar density. Appalachian corridors revealed their own clusters. While national parks host millions of visitors annually, certain regions produced disproportionate numbers of vanishings relative to foot traffic. In North Carolina, 32-year-old Hannah Mercer disappeared while hiking a well-traveled segment of the Appalachian Trail. She was an experienced hiker, physically fit and familiar with backcountry navigation. According to reports, she moved slightly ahead of her companion to photograph a rock formation overlooking a stream. The distance between them remained within visible range. A fog bank rolled in with unusual speed, reducing clarity along the ridge. When her companion reached the overlook minutes later, Hannah was gone. Search efforts began within hours. Canine units were deployed at first light the following morning. The dogs tracked her scent from the trailhead to a granite outcrop near the water's edge, and then stopped. Handlers described the behavior as abrupt, not hesitant. There was no gradual fading of scent, no directional pull deeper into the forest. It ended at stone. The surrounding terrain showed no signs of struggle, no disturbed soil, no broken branches indicating rapid movement. Weather data from that day indicated a sudden pressure shift, coinciding with the fog's arrival. While microclimates are common in mountainous regions, the timing paralleled other cases where atmospheric changes occurred shortly after disappearance reports. Storm cells, fog fronts, or unexpected temperature drops repeatedly complicated search operations. In isolation, such shifts could be explained as coincidence. Within the broader pattern, they became harder to dismiss. Another anomaly involved water proximity. Streams, lakes, and rivers frequently appeared within close range of last known locations. Standard lost person behavior studies suggest individuals gravitate toward water sources when disoriented. Yet in many of these cases, extensive searches along waterways produced no evidence. In some instances, remains were later discovered uphill from water sources, contradicting expected movement patterns. The pattern extended beyond geography. Victim profiles also revealed consistencies. Many were physically capable, mentally stable, and experienced outdoors. They were not reckless thrill seekers wandering off trail without preparation. Some were former military personnel, endurance athletes, or seasoned hikers. Their skill sets should have reduced vulnerability, not increased it. Yet their cases appeared within the same clustered regions. Resistance from federal agencies added another layer of complexity. Requests for comprehensive missing persons data across national parks encountered bureaucratic obstacles. There was no centralized database dedicated solely to tracking disappearances in wilderness areas. Records were dispersed across jurisdictions, filed under varying categories, and often difficult to cross-reference. Without unified data, patterns remained obscured from public view. Still, when compiled independently, the consistencies persisted. Brief separation, sudden environmental shifts, dogs unable to track beyond natural boundaries, particularly granite fields. Victims found, when recovered, in areas previously searched or in locations physically difficult to access. The repetition created an uneasy symmetry. Critics argued that pattern recognition can exaggerate coincidence. In large datasets, similarities inevitably appear. Wilderness environments share common features: water sources, rock formations, unpredictable weather. However, proponents of deeper analysis countered that the frequency of aligned factors exceeded what random distribution would typically produce. The debate itself became part of the narrative, not about supernatural causes, but about statistical anomaly. As investigators continued aligning cases from Colorado to California to the Carolinas, the emotional tone shifted. Families, who once believed their loved one's disappearance was singular, began realizing others had vanished under nearly identical circumstances. The realization did not provide comfort. It introduced uncertainty. If a pattern existed, what did it imply? Environmental hazard, data oversight, something overlooked within search protocols. The wilderness is vast, but it is not chaotic. Trails are mapped, terrain is studied, behavior patterns are documented. When disappearances align across decades and landscapes, randomness becomes an insufficient explanation. The emerging clusters suggested either an undiscovered environmental factor or a flaw in understanding how people move and survive in certain conditions. As Hannah Mercer's case joined the growing archive, investigators marked another point on the map. Another disappearance near Granite. Another scent trail ending abruptly. Another weather shift complicating recovery. The panic surrounding each individual case remained raw and personal. But beneath that panic, a structural pattern was forming. one that demanded recognition. And as more case files were added to the grid, a deeper unease began to surface among those tasked with searching. Because when trained professionals entered these clustered zones, something even more disturbing began to happen. America's wilderness search and rescue teams are built for chaos. They train for avalanches, flash floods, broken legs miles from trailheads, and hikers who underestimate distance and daylight. Their systems are methodical, layered, and technologically advanced. When someone goes missing, protocols activate with precision. Timelines are reconstructed, last known points are marked. Search grids expand in calculated increments. Statistically, these methods work. Most lost hikers are found within hours or days. But in certain cases tied to the growing pattern, the machinery of search begins to fail in ways that professionals struggle to explain. When Marcus Whitaker disappeared in western Montana, the response was immediate. A former high school track coach, in excellent physical condition, Marcus had been hiking a moderate loop trail he had completed twice before. He separated briefly from two friends to scout a scenic overlook less than a quarter-mile off the main path. The plan was simple. He would circle back within minutes. When 15 minutes passed with no sign of him, his friends walked toward the overlook. The path was clear. The view was empty. Marcus was gone. Search and rescue units arrived before nightfall. His last known location was logged with GPS accuracy. Weather conditions were stable, visibility high. Teams began with hasty searches along likely routes of travel, followed by structured grid sweeps. Thermal imaging drones were deployed after sunset, scanning ravines and tree lines for heat signatures. Nothing matched human form. Canine teams were brought in at dawn. The dogs picked up Marcus's scent from his vehicle in the parking lot and tracked it along the main trail without hesitation. They followed it toward the junction leading to the overlook. There, near a granite shelf overlooking a shallow valley, the behavior shifted. The dogs circled tightly. Handlers encouraged them forward. They widened the perimeter. The scent trail did not gradually fade, as it would if wind or time had dispersed it. It stopped. Handlers later described the termination point as abrupt, as if the scent had lifted vertically, rather than continued horizontally. The surrounding area showed no disturbance. No sliding gravel suggested a fall. No broken branches indicated a scramble down the incline. The slope beneath the overlook was steep but navigable. Searchers descended carefully, combing the area in overlapping lines. No trace appeared. Over the next 5 days, more than 100 volunteers joined professional teams. Helicopters performed repeated sweeps at varying altitudes. Ground crews checked stream beds, rock crevices, and dense brush. Search managers used probability models based on lost person behavior statistics. As an experienced adult male, Marcus would statistically travel a certain average distance if mobile. The radius expanded accordingly. Still nothing. What unsettled many on the team was not merely the absence of evidence, but the lack of directional clues. In typical missing person cases, even minimal signs, a displaced rock, a scuffed patch of soil, a dropped item, provide momentum for the search. Here, the environment appeared untouched. It was not as though Marcus had run or stumbled. It was as though he had stepped out of sequence. After 10 days, the search officially scaled back, though volunteers continued informal efforts. Weeks passed. Then, nearly a month later, a pair of hunters reported discovering remains, less than a mile from the original overlook, in an area documented as thoroughly searched during the first 72 hours. The location was not concealed by unusual terrain. It sat within a patch of sparse trees, visible from multiple angles. Marcus's boots were found several yards away from the body. His clothing showed no signs of animal predation. The official cause of death was listed as undetermined due to environmental exposure and the condition of the remains. Yet the question persisted: how had extensive search lines missed him in an area already covered? search and rescue professionals understand the limits of visibility. Dense foliage, terrain shadows, and human error can obscure evidence. But in this case, the recovery site had been walked through more than once. GPS logs confirmed coverage. The discovery introduced a phenomenon some team members privately referred to as reappearing zones. Areas where victims are later found despite documented earlier searches. This was not unique to Marcus Whittaker's case. Within the broader pattern, several victims were recovered in locations previously scanned by both ground crews and aerial units. In certain reports, remains were discovered near the original last known point after extended absence. Each instance could be rationalized individually. Combined, they began to erode confidence in standard search assumptions. The psychological impact on search teams is rarely discussed publicly. These volunteers and professionals commit exhaustive effort under intense emotional pressure. When a search concludes without resolution, doubt lingers. When a body is later found in a searched zone, that doubt sharpens. Was something overlooked? Did environmental conditions conceal the victim initially? Or had something about the timing defied expectation? Technology, designed to reduce uncertainty, offered limited reassurance. Thermal imaging depends on heat contrast. Once body temperature equalizes with surroundings, detection becomes more difficult. GPS mapping ensures grid coverage, but cannot guarantee perfect visual penetration through brush and terrain folds. Every tool carries limitations. Yet in these clustered cases, the limitations appear amplified. As more search coordinators quietly compared notes across states, subtle similarities emerged. Abrupt scent termination near rock formations. Victims recovered in accessible but previously cleared areas. Minimal environmental disturbance. The data did not point toward a clear alternative explanation. It simply highlighted gaps in the current one. The wilderness is vast, but it is not unknowable. Search protocols are built on decades of behavioral science and field experience. When those protocols consistently produce blind spots in specific geographic pockets, the question shifts from operational error to environmental anomaly. And as investigators reviewed additional case files, another category began drawing attention: cases involving children whose recoveries defied not only search logic, but basic physical expectation. Children get lost in the wilderness every year. It is one of the most feared scenarios for any parent standing at the edge of a trail. Standard search and rescue data shows predictable patterns. Young children tend to hide when frightened, often curling beneath brush or drifting downhill along natural slopes. Their movement range is usually limited by stamina, terrain, and fear. Search teams rely heavily on these behavioral baselines when calculating probability zones. But within the growing cluster of disappearances, tied to remote wilderness areas, a subset of cases involving children refuses to align with those expectations. In southern Oregon, 6-year-old Logan Pierce accompanied his grandparents on a late summer outing near a forested lake. The area was not extreme backcountry. Campsites dotted the shoreline. Families fished from wooden docks. Logan wandered only a short distance from a picnic table to collect berries visible at the tree line. His grandmother maintained visual contact for most of that minute. When she glanced down to organize supplies and looked back up, he was gone. The immediate assumption was that Logan had stepped deeper into the brush. His grandfather followed the most obvious path into the trees, calling his name. The forest floor was layered in soft earth and pine needles, ideal for tracking small footprints. Yet, within a short span, the visible trail patterns blended into older disturbances. There were no fresh prints clearly identifiable as Logan's. No snapped twigs at child height. No torn clothing caught on branches. It was as if his movement had left no signature. Local authorities responded quickly. Given Logan's age, search urgency escalated. Hasty teams fanned out in radial patterns from the last known point. Canine units arrived within hours. The dogs initially tracked scent a short distance toward the lake's edge, but then veered sharply uphill toward a rocky incline inconsistent with expected child behavior. Handlers followed. The scent appeared to strengthen near a granite, studded slope, and then dissipated entirely. The incline itself posed difficulty even for adults. It rose at an angle that required deliberate footing. Loose stone and exposed roots made ascent slow. For a 6-year-old without hiking boots, the climb would have been exhausting. Yet 2 days later, Logan was found alive nearly 2 miles from the picnic site, and several hundred vertical feet higher in elevation. He was sitting beneath a sparse tree line, mildly dehydrated but without major injury. Medical evaluation indicated fatigue and mild exposure, but no fractures, no severe bruising, and no signs of prolonged panic behavior. When asked about his experience, Logan's recollections were fragmented. He described following something indistinct, then feeling tired, then sleeping. There was no clear narrative of climbing, no memory of deliberate uphill travel, and no explanation for how he navigated terrain that challenged trained volunteers. Search professionals reviewing the case noted several anomalies. Children under 7 typically travel downhill when lost due to gravity and energy conservation. They rarely climb steep inclines without strong motivation. Additionally, the distance Logan covered within the estimated time window exceeded average mobility models for his age group. Even accounting for adrenaline, the uphill elevation gain strained plausibility. Logan's survival was a relief. But his case joined a growing category of recoveries, where children were located in places counterintuitive to establish search logic. In other documented instances, children vanished briefly from campsites or trails and were found miles away near water sources, granite fields, or dense rock formations. Some were discovered in areas that had already been scanned during initial search phases. Another recurring detail surfaced in several reports: an unusual stillness in the environment before disappearance. Adults described moments when birdsong diminished or wind patterns shifted subtly. These accounts varied and could be attributed to heightened stress perception. Yet their repetition across cases invited attention. The wilderness is dynamic, silence can occur naturally. But within emotionally charged timelines, such details became etched into memory. Importantly, not all child disappearances ended with recovery. In some cases, extensive searches produced no trace. The absence of evidence in those files deepened unease among investigators. When children are lost in wooded areas, typical outcomes include discovery within a defined radius. When that radius expands repeatedly without result, probability models begin to erode. Critics argue that children's movements are unpredictable. Fear can override logical direction. They may pursue visual stimuli or wander without pattern. While this is true, statistical baselines still apply across thousands of historical cases. The anomalies arise when distance, elevation, terrain difficulty, and scent termination converge simultaneously. In analyzing Logan Pierce's case alongside others, investigators highlighted key consistencies: brief separation measured in seconds or minutes, canine scent disruption near granite or water, unexpected elevation gain, and limited memory recall upon recovery. None of these factors alone suggest impossibility. Together, they sketch a pattern that resists conventional framing. For families, the analysis provides little comfort. The fear of sudden disappearance lingers long after recovery or closure. For search teams, child cases intensify urgency and emotional strain. Every hour amplifies risk. Every grid cleared without result increases pressure. When outcomes defy behavioral expectations, confidence in predictive models weakens. The wilderness does not adjust itself for human logic. But when multiple children traverse distances and elevations beyond predicted capacity, within compressed timelines and without clear physical markers, the conversation shifts from isolated anomaly to recurring irregularity. And as investigators continued mapping these child cases against broader disappearance clusters. Another troubling element surfaced. Many of the most puzzling recoveries, both adult and child, occurred in terrain seasoned climbers described as nearly unreachable. In wilderness survival analysis, terrain dictates probability. Slopes influence direction. Water channels shape travel paths. Vegetation density limits speed. Search and rescue teams build strategies around these predictable environmental constraints. When a missing person case unfolds, topographical maps become central tools. Elevation models, rock density, and natural barriers help narrow possibilities. But within certain disappearance clusters, recovery sites have repeatedly contradicted the logic of terrain itself. In the Sierra Nevada range of California, 38-year-old Daniel Brooks set out on a solo day hike along a marked trail known for its granite ridgelines and sweeping alpine views. He was physically fit, an experienced backpacker, and equipped with standard day hike supplies. The route was not classified as technical climbing terrain. It featured moderate inclines, scattered rock shelves, and occasional narrow switchbacks hugging exposed stone. Daniel texted a friend shortly before noon, confirming he had reached a scenic overlook. Weather conditions were stable. No storms were forecast. When he failed to return to his vehicle by dusk, authorities initiated search procedures. His last known location was identified with reasonable precision based on cell data and eyewitness accounts from other hikers. Search teams quickly established perimeter grids radiating from the overlook. Helicopters scanned the valley below, as downhill travel is statistically more common among lost hikers. Ground crews examined gullies and brush pockets where someone might seek shelter. Nothing surfaced. No dropped water bottle, no scuffed rock, no torn fabric caught on jagged stone. On the second day, search coordinators extended operations uphill toward steeper granite formations. The incline in that direction was sharp and fragmented, with exposed slabs requiring deliberate hand placement for safe ascent. Even experienced hikers approached the section cautiously. The assumption was that Daniel would not have climbed higher without purpose, especially as daylight waned. 4 days later, Daniel's body was discovered near the crest of a granite ridge nearly 1,500 vertical feet above his last confirmed position. The location was not adjacent to a marked trail. It required navigating a series of angled slabs and narrow ledges. There was no climbing equipment at the site. His boots showed normal wear but no excessive tearing. The official report cited exposure as the likely cause of death, though the timeline between disappearance and fatality remained uncertain. The question that unsettled both investigators and search volunteers was not simply how Daniel died, but how he arrived there. Statistical behavior models for missing hikers indicate that individuals under stress tend to follow terrain downward, conserving energy and seeking water sources. Ascending steep granite formations without clear navigational intent contradicts those patterns. Additionally, no clear ascent path was visible in the surrounding rock dust or vegetation. Granite surfaces can be unforgiving to track analysis, but the absence of disturbance stood out. Another factor frequently noted in similar cases is the presence of removed footwear or clothing. In some instances, victims are found without boots or with garments folded nearby. Medical literature recognizes paradoxical undressing as a symptom of advanced hypothermia, where victims experience a false sensation of warmth. While this phenomenon is documented, its recurrence within clustered disappearances raises complex timing questions. Hypothermia-induced behavior typically occurs in prolonged exposure scenarios. Yet in certain cases, environmental conditions did not appear severe enough to trigger rapid onset. Terrain anomalies are not limited to mountainous regions. In parts of the Pacific Northwest, dense forests intersect with volcanic rock formations and river-carved canyons. Several recoveries have occurred in areas described by responders as unlikely endpoints. Narrow rock shelves, elevated clearings surrounded by thick brush, or small open pockets not visible from standard search lines. In multiple instances, these sites were within areas previously searched, though terrain folds or visual obstructions may have contributed to initial oversight. Critics caution against overstating terrain improbability. Wilderness landscapes are complex. Search grids, while systematic, cannot guarantee perfect visual penetration across every rock seam and vegetative layer. Human error, fatigue, and shifting light conditions affect detection. Yet, what continues to draw attention is the repetition of upward movement and difficult access recovery zones across multiple states and decades. Water proximity also persists as a variable. In some cases, victims are found near alpine streams at elevations inconsistent with their last known location. While water sources can draw disoriented individuals, the combination of steep ascent followed by lateral movement toward water complicates standard behavior predictions. Topographical data analysis in these clusters suggests that certain granite-rich zones correspond with higher concentrations of unusual recoveries. Granite itself is not inherently mysterious. It is a common geological formation across U.S. mountain ranges. However, its structural characteristics, smooth slabs, fissures, reflective surfaces, can complicate tracking efforts and visual searches. Whether this contributes directly to anomaly patterns remains debated. For search professionals, terrain defines strategy. When terrain appears to contradict behavior models repeatedly, strategy must adapt. Yet adaptation requires understanding cause. Without clarity, each case resets the process from uncertainty. Daniel Brooks' file joined others marked by elevation irregularity and minimal physical trace. His final location overlooked miles of forest, a vantage point that felt deliberate but unexplained. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of physical confrontation, no clear indicator of panic-driven flight. Only position, high, exposed, and statistically unexpected. As more of these terrain-defying recoveries accumulated, investigators began noting another layer of inconsistency. In several of the same regions where granite ridges and upward recoveries occurred, electronic devices, GPS units, mobile phones, emergency beacons, displayed unexplained signal disruptions. And when technology itself begins to falter, in the same geographic pockets, where people vanish and reappear, the boundaries between environmental limitation and anomaly become increasingly difficult to define. In modern wilderness travel, technology functions as a safety net. GPS devices triangulate position within feet. Smartphones connect to satellite networks even beyond cell tower range. Emergency locator beacons transmit distress signals across vast distances. Search and rescue teams rely heavily on these digital footprints to narrow timelines and geographic focus. In most missing person cases, electronic data provides at least one reliable anchor point. But within certain disappearance clusters, that anchor point vanishes along with the individual. In Alaska's backcountry, 29-year-old Tyler Haynes embarked on a solo photography hike through a region known for open ridgelines and scattered spruce forests. Tyler was not reckless. He carried a fully charged smartphone, a handheld GPS unit, and a satellite messaging device designed for remote terrain. Before leaving the trailhead, he sent a time-stamped message confirming his intended route. Weather conditions were clear, visibility extended for miles. At approximately 20:17 p.m., Tyler's GPS log recorded his coordinates near a shallow granite basin intersected by a narrow stream. Moments later, the tracking signal stopped updating. His satellite messenger, programmed to send automatic position pings every 10 minutes, failed to transmit its next scheduled update. Family members monitoring the feed initially assumed temporary interference. When no further signals arrived for hours, concern escalated. Search and rescue operations began with digital triangulation attempts. Authorities attempted to re-establish connection with Tyler's devices. The satellite provider reported no distress signal and no further communication after the final logged coordinates. Weather remained stable. No geomagnetic storms or atmospheric disturbances were recorded that day. Aircraft were deployed to the last known location, flying grid patterns while attempting radio contact. No response came through. Ground teams navigated toward the granite basin identified in the final GPS record. The terrain was uneven but navigable. The stream ran shallow and clear. There were no signs of struggle, no dropped equipment, no visible slide marks down adjacent slopes. Tyler's footprint trail from earlier sections of the hike appeared normal, then gradually blended into rock, heavy terrain. As in other cases, canine units tracked scent to a point near exposed granite, and then lost direction entirely. Digital failure in wilderness environments is not unheard of. GPS devices can experience brief signal loss in deep canyons or under heavy canopy cover. Batteries drain faster in cold temperatures. Satellite messaging can be obstructed by terrain blocking line of sight communication. Yet in Tyler's case, the final signal occurred in relatively open terrain, with clear sky overhead. Device diagnostics later indicated no mechanical malfunction prior to signal cessation. Search coordinators considered the possibility of water damage. If Tyler had slipped into the stream, devices could have shorted. Divers checked deeper pools downstream. Nothing surfaced. The stream's flow pattern did not support rapid downstream displacement of a body without trace. Helicopters equipped with forward-looking infrared systems scanned the broader basin over multiple days. No heat signature consistent with human presence was detected. One element increasingly discussed among investigators in clustered disappearances is the presence of granite, dense terrain. Granite formations, particularly when expansive and exposed, can interfere with radio and satellite signal reflection. While granite itself does not block GPS signals entirely, complex rock geometry combined with atmospheric conditions can create localized dead zones. However, such interference is typically partial and temporary. It does not usually result in complete and sustained signal termination across multiple devices simultaneously. In Tyler's case, both his handheld GPS and satellite messenger ceased transmission within the same time frame. His smartphone, recovered months later near the edge of the basin, displayed a drained battery, but no internal damage. Forensic review confirmed no outgoing messages or calls after 20:17 p.m. The abrupt silence marked a clean break in digital continuity. Search teams face immense reliance on technology during modern operations. Digital breadcrumbs reduce uncertainty. When those breadcrumbs disappear, the search reverts to analog methods: grid walking, visual scanning, probability modeling. In regions where terrain already complicates movement analysis, the absence of electronic guidance widens the field of uncertainty. Similar digital anomalies have appeared in other clustered cases. Hikers report phones freezing or battery levels dropping unexpectedly in granite, heavy zones. Some survivors describe brief compass disorientation. Aircraft crews occasionally note minor instrument fluctuations over specific ridgelines, though such reports are inconsistent and not formally classified as hazardous. Skeptics argue that electronic irregularities in remote environments are statistically inevitable. Devices fail. Batteries deplete faster under stress. Signal coverage varies with topography. These explanations hold weight in isolated events. What unsettles analysts is repetition within mapped clusters where disappearances, terrain irregularities, and signal loss intersect. Tyler Haynes' body was never recovered. His last confirmed position remains a static coordinate in digital archives. The granite basin continues to exist unchanged, visited by occasional hikers unaware of its unresolved history. The stream flows as it did that afternoon. Satellites continue to pass overhead, mapping terrain with mathematical precision. Yet at 20:17 p.m., on a clear Alaskan day, multiple tracking systems stopped simultaneously, and a physically capable adult vanished from both landscape and digital grid. No distress beacon activated. No final movement was logged, only silence. As investigators layered this digital anomaly over terrain irregularities and scent termination patterns, another dimension emerged in survivor accounts. Individuals who returned from brief disappearances describing gaps in time that did not align with recorded hours. When geography, technology, and tracking all fracture at once, the remaining variable becomes human perception itself. For most wilderness survival cases, timelines form the backbone of reconstruction. When did the subject separate from the group? How long until the search began? How many hours passed before recovery? Time creates structure. It defines exposure risk, movement range, and survival probability. But in several clustered disappearances, that structure begins to bend, not in measurable minutes alone, but in the perception of time reported by those who return. In Northern California, 34-year-old Caroline Hayes joined two colleagues for a weekend hiking retreat along a moderately trafficked forest trail. The route followed a river corridor before ascending into mixed pine and granite terrain. Caroline was an experienced runner with strong endurance and no known medical conditions. Around midday, she paused briefly to adjust her shoe near a shallow bend in the river. Her companions walked ahead, assuming she would catch up within seconds. When they noticed her absence minutes later, they retraced their steps. The trail behind them was straight and open. Caroline was not visible in either direction. Calls echoed across the water. There was no response. Within 30 minutes, park authorities were alerted. Search efforts began that same afternoon. Canine teams traced her scent from the trailhead through the river bend, then toward a granite, studded embankment. As in prior cases, the scent trail appeared to diminish abruptly near rock, heavy terrain. Weather remained stable. No storm interference complicated visibility. Helicopters scanned the surrounding forest canopy before dusk. Nothing surfaced. Caroline was found 48 hours later sitting beneath a cluster of trees, nearly 2 miles from the last known point. The location was not dramatically elevated, but it required navigating uneven ground and light brush. She was conscious, mildly dehydrated, and physically fatigued, but without severe injury. When asked what had happened, her recollection was fragmented. She reported stepping off the trail briefly, noticing an unusual quiet in the forest, and then feeling disoriented. She believed only a short time had passed, perhaps an hour. She described resting and waiting to regain her bearings. She did not recall traveling significant distance, nor did she remember hearing search helicopters overhead during the night. Medical evaluation confirmed mild exposure consistent with 2 days outdoors, yet her internal sense of elapsed time did not align with objective records. Her wristwatch, later examined, had stopped at 12 p.m., though impact or battery issues could not be definitively ruled out. While watches malfunction, the symbolic weight of a frozen timestamp reinforced the perception gap between experience and reality. Time distortion under stress is not uncommon. Psychological research shows that trauma and fear can compress or elongate perceived duration. Dehydration and sleep deprivation impair cognitive sequencing. Yet in clustered disappearance cases, similar reports emerge with striking consistency. Survivors describe brief lapses followed by abrupt awareness in unfamiliar locations. They recount confusion about direction and distance traveled. Some express certainty that they had not moved far, despite GPS mapping showing otherwise. In other documented recoveries, individuals have been located in areas previously searched within short timeframes, while search overlap and human error remain plausible explanations. The layering of time perception irregularities deepens ambiguity. Did the individual move after initial searches? Were they concealed in ways not immediately visible? Or does stress distort memory to such degree that reconstructing sequence becomes unreliable? Neurological responses to acute stress can produce dissociation, a protective mechanism in which awareness narrows and temporal continuity fractures. The brain prioritizes survival over memory formation, This can result in blank spaces within recall. However, dissociation typically occurs alongside visible panic behavior or attempts to flee. In several survivor cases within disappearance clusters, physical signs of panic are minimal. Injuries are limited. Clothing remains intact. Caroline Hayes' case joined others featuring proximity to water and granite terrain. She reported hearing the river faintly at one point, but could not determine direction. She described a sense of circular movement, without visual landmarks changing significantly. Search teams reviewing her account noted that the area contained repeating rock formations and similar tree patterns, which can contribute to spatial confusion. Still, what unsettles investigators is not that confusion occurred. It is the scale of mismatch between subjective time and objective duration. 48 hours compressed into what felt like a fraction. Nightfall unnoticed. Helicopter rotors unheard. Distance covered without conscious memory of exertion. In broader disappearance analysis, time is expected to degrade under stress. But when multiple survivors across states report analogous distortions, combined with terrain anomalies, scent termination, and digital silence, the convergence becomes difficult to ignore. Skeptics maintain that wilderness environments naturally disorient even experienced individuals. Uniform landscapes, limited reference points, and psychological fear amplify cognitive disruption. These explanations are grounded in research. Yet repetition within geographic clusters sustains ongoing inquiry. Caroline eventually returned home physically stable. The forest resumed its quiet routines. The river continued carving its shallow path through granite. On paper, her case resolved as a temporary lost hiker incident. In the larger pattern, it represented another data point where time itself seemed unreliable. As analysts compiled demographic data from recovered and unrecovered cases alike, a final pattern began emerging, one not centered on terrain, technology, or time, but on the profiles of those who vanished. And that pattern would raise perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all. When disappearances are discussed in public forums, the assumption often leans toward inexperience. The lost are imagined as reckless hikers, underprepared tourists, or individuals who ignored warning signs. But as investigators assembled demographic data across clustered wilderness cases, that assumption weakened. The emerging profile did not consistently match carelessness. In many instances, it reflected competence. Ryan Mitchell was 36 years old, a former Marine with advanced land navigation training and years of backcountry experience. He joined a small group hiking through a mountainous corridor in the Pacific Northwest known for granite ridgelines and glacier-fed streams. The terrain was challenging but well within his physical capacity. Weather conditions were clear. Visibility extended across valleys without obstruction. At one point during the ascent, Ryan paused briefly to scout a secondary path branching from the main trail. The rest of the group remained within audible range. He stepped behind a cluster of trees and rock outcroppings. Seconds passed, then a minute. When his companions rounded the same outcropping, he was no longer visible. They assumed he had looped back toward the primary trail. He had not. Search teams responded rapidly, given Ryan's training background and the unusual nature of the separation. His experience made accidental misnavigation statistically less likely. Canine units followed scent from the trailhead to the branching path, then toward a granite, dense section overlooking a stream. As in multiple prior cases, the scent appeared to end abruptly. No drag marks, no displaced vegetation, no dropped equipment. Over several days, search operations expanded across steep slopes and riverbanks. Helicopters scanned exposed rock faces. Volunteers moved in structured grids. Ryan was not located. The absence of physical evidence contrasted sharply with his survival skill set. Individuals with his background typically leave discernible signs when traveling off-trail: broken brush, deliberate markers, altered terrain. None were found. Ryan Mitchell's profile aligned with a recurring demographic theme within disappearance clusters. Many victims were physically fit adults between 25 and 50 years old. Several held professional or academic accomplishments. Some were endurance athletes. Others had military or wilderness training. A subset included children described as intellectually advanced for their age. While these attributes do not define immunity from getting lost, their overrepresentation across mapped clusters raised analytical questions. Demographic consistency extended beyond physical capability. Mental health histories in documented cases frequently revealed no prior instability. Toxicology reports, when available, showed no impairing substances. In many instances, victims were described as focused, goal-oriented individuals with strong situational awareness. Critics caution against drawing causal implications from demographic patterns. Active adults are more likely to frequent wilderness areas, thereby increasing exposure risk. Children hiking with families naturally appear within park statistics. However, the clustering effect complicates purely exposure-based explanations. When physically capable individuals disappear within defined geographic pockets, under similar conditions, pattern recognition persists. Institutional response to these emerging patterns has remained restrained. Federal agencies acknowledge missing persons cases individually, but do not formally categorize them within a unified wilderness anomaly framework. Requests for consolidated data across national parks have historically encountered administrative barriers. Without centralized tracking specific to wilderness disappearances, cross-referencing remains limited to independent investigators and researchers. The absence of an integrated national database dedicated solely to park-related disappearances contributes to fragmentation. Each case is processed within its local jurisdiction, often without comparative review against similar incidents elsewhere. As a result, clusters become visible primarily through external compilation, rather than internal federal reporting systems. Media coverage also reflects disparity. Urban disappearances frequently generate sustained national attention. Wilderness cases often remain regional, fading once search efforts conclude. The forest absorbs narrative momentum as easily as it absorbs sound. Families are left with private grief rather than public discourse. Yet when case files from Colorado, California, Montana, Oregon, North Carolina, and Alaska are placed side by side, demographic similarities remain visible. Competent hikers, experienced outdoorsmen, children under close supervision, brief separations, granite proximity, water nearby, scent trails ending, technology failing, terrain contradicting behavior models, time perception fracturing. Ryan Mitchell's case remains unresolved. His file sits alongside others marked by absence rather than conclusion. For his family, statistical patterns offer little comfort. For investigators, patterns demand acknowledgement even without definitive explanation. It is possible that environmental variables, complex terrain geometry, microclimates, and human cognitive vulnerability intersect in rare but repeatable ways. It is also possible that current search models underestimate certain movement behaviors in granite-heavy ecosystems. What remains clear is that no single theory accounts for every aligned detail across decades of cases. The American wilderness continues to draw millions seeking solitude and perspective. Most return safely with photographs and stories. A fraction do not. Their profiles challenge assumptions about preparedness and predictability. Their cases, when mapped collectively, resist classification as simple misadventure. In the end, the silence surrounding these clusters may not indicate concealment, but uncertainty. Agencies operate within evidence-based frameworks. Without conclusive proof of systemic anomaly, cases remain individual tragedies. Yet the convergence of geography, technology, terrain, time distortion, and demographic consistency leaves an open question lingering at the edge of every granite ridge and river bend, until comprehensive data unifies these threads under transparent analysis. The forests where these individuals vanished will remain more than scenic landscapes. They will remain coordinates on a map where logic falters, patterns emerge, and answers remain just beyond reach. The American wilderness remains vast, beautiful, and indifferent. Most who enter it return with stories, photographs, and memories, but a few leave behind only coordinates and unanswered timelines. Across granite ridges and quiet riverbanks, patterns persist that resist simple explanation. Search teams refine their methods. Technology grows sharper, yet certain vanishings remain incomplete. Each case stands alone, but together they form a question that has not been resolved. Until every disappearance is fully accounted for, some parts of the forest will remain more than landscape. They will remain silence marked on a map. If you hike, camp, or explore America's wild places, start paying closer attention. Not just to the trail ahead, but to the patterns beneath it. Look at the maps. Notice the clusters. Ask why certain details repeat. Share this story with someone who believes every mystery has a logical answer, and see where the conversation leads. Because the more people who examine the data, the harder it becomes for unanswered cases to stay invisible.